my research is looking at meanwhile use in the context of urban regeneration strategies. And I am using scenario planning methodologies and participatory action research to do so. I will be drawing from London-based case studies, and I will continue working in Madrid through participatory action. And I'm looking at urban farming as a framework and as a way to kind of question time as a strategic dimension to design public space and how tactical urbanism can lead to sustainable and long-term approaches. And also that of obviously stimulating a sustainable culture of participation, which is the basis of how these initiatives actually start. So meanwhile use is a word that everyone knows these days, has boomed over the past 15 to 20 years by now. Report says that in London at the moment there are at least surveyed 200,000 square meters, which is double the floor of Selfridges, so it's a big amount of space. And they're different in scope and size, and they offer workspace, but also they offer, these projects encompass also urban farms. So it's not really easy to kind of pin down what you expect from a meanwhile use and what's the approach to it. The thing is, it captured the interest of developers and landowners. And in fact, when you look at the statistics, you can see that how London boroughs and developers are the meanwhile use provider, the first basically meanwhile use providers. What distinguishes a meanwhile use from a temporary use is basically land availability and duration. So a temporary use usually pops out on a permanent development for a gig, whereas meanwhile use it's more extended in time, and it's an interim use somehow. And we will see how many of these uses have a very long duration, which kind of makes you question if that is a meanwhile or what a meanwhile exactly is. Despite the idea of temporary use is not new, the scenario is completely different. Today, land value increases sharply and developments get bigger and bigger. So the risk about the risk on the uses, it's a high risk. And developers are starting to get interested in these practices and commission reports to people like Arup or a Centre for London, and GLA is commissioning research on that. And these researchers are actually impacting on the resilience strategies and the recently published London plan. While everyone is trying to understand what meanwhile use exactly is, many initiatives long years ago I started working with this framework in a very non-defined way. Skip Garden, for example, was initiated by Global Generation, which is a charity. Actually, I didn't mention what distinguishes a meanwhile use in particular is that they are professionally managed, operated, and initiated by charities or social enterprises, and they're enabled in collaboration, like wider collaboration with teams of architects, but also constructors and other people that actually joins in under the same cause. Skip Garden, for example, it's a project that was initiated, actually Argent, the developer of King's Cross, a major redevelopment in London, approached Global Generation, and they wanted to use the site on a rolling basis to have food growing in it. And despite the idea of growing food in skips seems a bit naive for some of you maybe, this has been very successful and was active still for 10 years, growing and actually creating this sort of sense of community around it, and which was a kind of a learning, a shared space where people actually felt really drawn, and the garden actually managed to survive and change its shape. And actually today it's at the British Library, occupying a larger site, and it's going to be active until 2022, while the lease gets extended year after year. So I think this is a very interesting rippling effect because also global generation now has acquired the skills to manage other garden and working with British Land, another developer, and Southward Council, and has managed to obtain the planning permission for permanent use for a learning space and a shed in the development of Canada Water. So that's quite surprising. Another language, another kind of project, still in London, is the Waterloo City Farm that was initiated jointly between Jamie's Farm, Oasis Community Hub, and Felden Falls Architect, which both needed a house, basically. And they obtained a lease with Guy and St. Thomas Hospital to build what is a very successful space and that hosts the offices of the architect, as well as these learning spaces, which you can see in the photograph. This project was actually built with £150,000. So very cheap. Another experience with interesting rippling effect is the Loveborough Junction farm, which was initiated by the Loveborough Junction Action Group. As you can see in the top left photo, it was initially a very makeshift kind of solution to grow urban food, and over years, from 2013, the group grew and occupied spaces across the junction. So there's a cafe, there is a food growing space, and they now obtain a 20 years lease on the land to develop what is LJ Works, together with Public Works, Architecture 00, and it's professionally operated by meanwhile Space CIC, which is another social enterprise which actually supports the management of these spaces, and it's training local community. It's going to do it for 8 years, and it's going to train local communities to actually run and manage this business in all effects. They have a community kitchen, urban growing food growing spaces, and workshop. So it is true that developers and landowners are capturing this as an opportunity to kind of like lower the pressure on their development. But it's also true that these initiatives are kind of like connecting points in this cartography where, for example, when you look like they basically are taking active steps towards what FAO in 2011 was telling us, that our food system is on the verge of collapse. And but also what the food strategy is reminding us how good food growing and community gardening brings social benefits, environmental benefits, contributing to London's green infrastructure, and economic benefits, because they're actually working businesses. The way these projects actually worked also influenced the London Resilience Strategy, which now encourages across the action meanwhile space, and the reports written by Arab, which are published in 2020, also were written and commissioned by GLA to kind of help and structure across the policies in the London Plan, which mention how we obviously have to have a green infrastructure approach, which is today something that we hear more and more, and how food growing can actually, food growing and this initiative on a meanwhile basis can also contribute to the intensification of green infrastructure. So what do we mean by temporary? I mean, 20 years is quite a long time. I think it's interesting to kind of think and read. This is a book published in 2014, The Temporary City by Peter Bishops. It's actually interesting to think of a temporary activity as something intentional. So something is temporary if there is an intention for it to be so. Otherwise, it's not. And actually, we can think about everything is temporary in a long term. So in a way, like what is temporary is also our life. So it's the life, it's the soft infrastructure. It's what actually, what actually uses what actually plugs into what is permanent. That we can assess. We can say that is the infrastructure, okay, which also in the long term it changes its use. So we're in this kind of weird loop cycle where everything that we thought it was temporary, our idea of temporary, our idea of permanent is actually misleading when we think of how these things work. So in an attempt to thinking of how we can master plan around temporary activity, how we can think and include these activities in master planning, it's interesting and to question what these reports, which are basically for developers, mention as transitional urbanism. That is a collective activation strategy towards a common goal. Like, what is this common goal? Where are we going in that sense? So it's very clear from reading these reports. They actually stated, despite the differences that we have in mean values projects, we can say that absolute values are efficiency, affordability, flexibility, right? And so if we look at the top, we can see that temporary uses or mean values is just a parenthesis towards a monorhythmic, linear conception of time and space, okay? Where the point we're heading towards is growth, but growth is economic and real estate development somehow. We have no time to waste, we have to use the opportunities offered by the vacancy of the sites. Hurry up, bring back life to the site. So it's a bit daunting in a way, you know, the responsibilities we're giving, and we have to like collectively come up with solutions and intensify green infrastructure and think of the future of our city and save the food system. Also, the temporary is increasingly a permanent trend. So I think in a way, it's interesting to look at temporary uses in a different way, and looking at the initiatives I just showed you, the values they bring, the values they initiated, the social enterprises that actually initiate these projects are driven by different values that are interdependence, care, togetherness, sharing and making the public, and collective self-determination. Self-determination is really important. So I think, I mean, many critics of temporary uses say that basically we have to kind of disrupt this narrative of basically, we should basically have less expectation of immediate change because we know that systemic changes take time, and small action can actually have an impact in the long term. So, and we need to kind of frame the city as a continuously produced, as something continuously produced through multiple space-time interactions. So we see how temporary uses can start like blurring and changing and affecting how the future is. So it's not that clear where we're going. There's no horizon, but there's a radical openness that is driven by a clear intention. I think it's interesting to look at how these initiatives also hit the ground somehow, where they're located and how they make use of sites. They're often in very difficult sites that basically are difficult in the sense that they not easy to develop, and they're often the last bits of larger regeneration strategy, and they happen to be often very close to infrastructural line or existing green infrastructure. Peter Bishops again mentioned these spaces as zones of tolerance in two ways. So a zone of tolerance is a space in the city where we're basically giving agency to the people that use it, and giving them agency to self-determine themselves somehow. I think what is also interesting is that these big regeneration projects are also happening around infrastructure that actually lost they're shrinking. We don't need this much anymore. So King's Cross is one of the examples, and so I question I'm questioning where all these points are leading towards. Even more when I'm looking at the master plan of Madrid Nuevo Norte, the project where I'm going to work for the following years, trying to introduce a framework on meanwhile initiative. This is also happening along a major rail line that is going to be basically adapted and partially covered to give space to a new major park. And obviously you can see the quantum, so I'm not going to expand on that. But they're also including a green artery which is supposed to connect the station to the national park El Pardo. And I think this, and I think what is interesting is that they're actually looking. The project is going to be developed in 20 years, and they're actually looking at including participation in this process. They have a social engagement group, and they're engaging with the surrounding neighborhood, not only with consultation, but they're also through competition. One competition which I also took part as a kind of advisor somehow, because they're trying to use meanwhile use to kind of design the green spaces of the park. So how to kind of start seeding the uses across the neighborhood and then bring them back into the park to kind of understand what is the demand behind this park or behind these green spaces. And I think what's striking is when you look out though, of these enclaves, so these new ways of making cities which are like somehow enclosures or enclaves, with the problem of the kind of the Frankenstein effect, of like a bad reaction to what the city is, or surrounding, you start seeing that there's a lot of underused space all around. And actually these are a result of poor planning and land speculation. So you see between the historic city and the new planned city, the difference between void and like solid and void, it's striking. But also you see how the infrastructure kind of defines where these voids are, how these voids are stretched across the city, which kind of like starts suggesting ideas on how these spaces, because they're difficult to develop, can be used for such uses in a very flexible way, and can also lead to long-term benefits. So here is a map of initiatives that are outside the meanwhile. Well, they could be called meanwhile because they're spaces that are given by the municipality on a short 5 years to 10 years lease, and this is the Red de Huertos Urbanos in Madrid. So it's a network of urban farms which are like subsidized by the municipality, and they have spaces across the city. They're very successful, and they have a network which connects them with Intermedia, Matadero Intermedia, and other associations. They have learning spaces, and basically it is a network. So I think that's what I'm looking at, how this small action can actually become networked and become powerful, however temporary. So to do that, and how do you kind of like sit on the table? How do you kind of make it work? Because this is something, this is a realm where multiple things come together. There's an issue of planning, because planning needs to facilitate this process, but there's also an awareness of what the role of our city is, right, in sustainable food system. But also how do you get the people around the table and participate? How do you kind of establish a culture of participation that is proactive? So scenario planning emerged as a way of kind of, as a methodology that has kind of an heritage in Jane Jacobs, all the way to Ritter and Weber. So we're looking at complex systems that have multiple interaction between themselves, and it's really hard to understand where how this work and how planning should work. So it seems like planning for an end future, as I was mentioning before, is very limiting. And scenario planning actually, using narrative and time, identifies multiple scenarios, multiple paths, and it's a collaborative practice. And so you basically sit around the table and identify 4 or 5 possible scenarios so that people are ready to kind of deal with the future, and they know where they're going and how they're going, which kind of also legitimates the issue of being temporary, because you know somehow how things are going to evolve. Then I think Robert Beale's sustainable food system and the role of the city is very interesting, because it kind of makes this analogy between agroecology and organics, so the complexity of these processes and regenerative processes, and against the monoculture, which is what the Green Revolution has brought us, and is bringing our food system to the collapse. And also that restructuring food system goes hand in hand with restructuring society. The two things cannot be separate. Therefore, radical movements such as the ones I showed you, or like the initiative, not movements, but initiative, have the power to affect this change. And also participation. Participation, obviously, it's a like common line throughout all the things I showed you. But it's interesting to see what the social dimension of participation, so a less tokenistic, less technocratic kind of practice of participation. And I want to look at artistic and curatorial practices to do so, because many of these initiatives, I couldn't show you all of them, but many of these are initiated by artists, And basically, they bring people together through artistic practices, and this is a culture that reaches back from Dada to Situationist, and all the way in the 90s to relational aesthetics. So it's an art that has an agenda, has agenda the activation, but of the subject, not of the site. Authorship, but seeding it, so giving it to people. And community, but community in a sense that you elaborate, collectively elaborate meaning. So somehow this requires a disciplinary shift, and that's where I'm kind of sitting, or where I want to kind of change my practice, and how I would like my practice to kind of be the intersection within these three complex and different realms. Thank you.
Perfect.